Good evening. This is Dr. Ari Aris of the Innovative Dad, and I am here tonight to talk to you a little bit about all of those new school plans that are being launched for what our kids are going to be doing for learning. And it seems like every day, at least in our area, that a school district is announcing its plans, changing its plans, adjusting its plans, uh, or generally in some respects, I would say driving all of us parents just a little bit crazy in terms of trying to figure out what we think is going to be best for our children, both from a health and safety standpoint, from a mental health standpoint, from a learning standpoint, and a lot of complex decisions that need to be made uh, by parents, by schools, by school districts in terms of sort of figuring out uh, what do we do in the upcoming school year. Now, the good news is that our schools and our teachers and our principals and all those educators that take care of our kids have had more time to be thinking about these decisions, to be making these decisions than we did when we made sort of the sudden switch this past March in most places from what we were used to as a traditional school year and getting on the bus and going to school and coming back on the bus or however you were getting back and forth to uh, this new world of remote learning, and my kids now know how to get themselves onto a Zoom call, enter a password into a Zoom session, raise their hand in a Zoom session. They know to walk around the house, and if they see one of us with headphones on and say, "Hey, are you on a call right now? Can I talk to you?" Which is sort of a crazy skill that we didn't think that they needed to develop, but is sort of the new normal uh, for all of us. And many of us are going to be experiencing more remote education uh, come the start of the school year. And our area, based here in suburban DC, the majority of the public school districts in our area have announced that they are starting the first part of their year with remote learning, which is going to be a challenge for many of us. But that particular challenge is going to be for our kids that are receiving special education services, because translating what had been written as a school-based plan on an individualized education plan into something that can be delivered in a remote environment is just a little bit more complicated because it's brand new for the educators that are involved in helping to design and implement these plans, to the parents that are partners at the table with the schools. And we all want our kids, regardless of their ability to survive and to do more than survive, but to thrive in this new learning environment. So I thought it'd be a great time to sort of pause and talk a little bit about what we know in terms of what's going on with remote learning and special education, and hit a few of the things to sort of think about, that if you are a parent of a child that has an IEP, in other words, special education services, or a 504 plan, to know what to do. And I'll drop in the comment section links to some posts that I've written previously that sort of describe what special education is for those of you who are unfamiliar with what I'm talking about, and also how to make some decisions between an IEP and a 504 plan for those of you that are thinking about that your child might need some supports in school. So let's really start off with some basics. Kids are going to be learning at home, a lot of them, across the country. What's the school district's obligation to provide any form of special education? Well, that's a place where we can safely say that nothing has really changed in terms of what schools are obligated to do. So if the district or the state has decided that all students are being taught at home for purposes of public safety, then we also need to have a plan in place for how those special education services will be delivered. Uh, and it might mean that we need to, increase the amount of assistive technology or tools or other supports that are in place. But that obligation, that requirement to deliver services still exists. Will they look the same as they did in a classroom? No. There's going to be distinct differences because they are about providing your child access to the general education curriculum, and what that general education curriculum is changing as well. So, a big piece is, okay, so what's going to happen to those services, the special education services, the related services like counseling or speech therapy or occupational therapy that are on a child's IEP? So at the federal level, the Department of Education has said that schools need to make every effort to provide special education and related services to students. Um, so that may look a little bit different. You're going to hear from your school, and you should be asking your school, how are those services going to be delivered? A lot of IEP services, for example, are delivered one-on-one or in small groups. So how is that going to work? Now, the good news is that there are increasing numbers of providers that have become trained in how to deliver telehealth services, which is what we call those related services when they're delivered via Zoom or some other kind of video conferencing platform. And the activities are being modified to try and meet those goals. And of course, there's the possibility that some services may be missed, and in which case you'll need to coordinate, or your school will need to let you know about what kind of compensatory or makeup services um, will be available at that point. But again, these plans are developed on an individualized basis. So what they're going to look like for any child is also going to be individualized. So it really involves you as the parent of asking a lot of questions in terms of how is this plan that was written for in-person service delivery going to look now that my kid only has an hour or 4 hours or whatever the number of hours is of direct instruction via video conferencing platform, and then a series of self-guided instruction or independent work that they need to be doing. All right, so some other things to sort of think about. I have an IEP meeting coming up, an annual review for my child, or a 504 meeting. How are we going to hold that? Am I going to have to go to the school building? Well, the good news is that federal law has always allowed families and schools to have remote IEP meetings. And I've certainly sat in a number of meetings that the parent has needed to call in either by video conference or by phone, just because of whatever is going on in their lives. Too difficult to get off work to leave, needing to deal with something else in their life, but still trying to prioritize this. So it's certainly nothing unusual for it to be taking place this way. There's some things to bear in mind of, first of all, you can ask for that meeting to occur at any time, and the school may ask for it to occur also. And your state, depending upon your local jurisdiction, may have some additional guidelines in terms of timing for IEP meetings. At a minimum, they're happening once a year with a triennial review that is a reevaluation of taking a look at your child's disability and do they still need services once every 3 years. Some sort of random things to kind of keep in mind is that be mindful of sort of your local wiretapping laws, which is something you never really thought you needed to pay attention to when dealing with your child's education. But you need to be mindful about whether or not you can record the meeting. In some states, unless you have consent of everybody that's participating in the recording of a meeting that's being recorded over a phone or via video conferencing, you do need their explicit consent for that. And some school districts also have policies against recording. It may be that the recording needs to be available to all of the participants, for example. The other piece to bear in mind is that your school, if you've become a Zoomophile and you're zooming everywhere, that may not be the software or the platform that's available for the IEP meeting, as it may not meet the privacy requirements that the school district is required to meet. And oftentimes that means whether or not they've got a contract with the company in terms of how it's going to handle any kind of confidential data. So you may have to use a platform that you're unfamiliar with. They all have some sort of basic things. So probably some kind of chat feature that you can use, and the ability to toggle your microphone or your video on and off. The other piece to sort of bear in mind is you may really want that in-person meeting, but so far the guidance in the federal government from the Department of Education is saying that IEP teams are not required to meet in person while the schools are physically closed. Sort of the next complicated area is, okay, I've asked for an evaluation, or it's time for a reevaluation for my child. What's that going to look like? The deadlines are set in a state-by-state basis. And the federal law doesn't provide any clear guidance for, like, stopping timelines. In fact, some of the legislation that was passed at the federal level gave the Secretary of Education the option of asking for specific waivers around timelines, and those were not requested, which is in line with what many of the advocacy groups for special education wanted, because they were concerned that allowing for any kind of waiver would slow down the process for kids. Big thing to say is you've got to look at the State Department of Education's website for your particular state to see if any new rules have been set out for deadlines, and also talking to the staff at your school that's responsible for evaluations in terms of how they're being uh, handled. Many schools are attempting to follow their deadlines and to conduct the evaluations as remotely as possible. And there's a fair amount of data that can be collected remotely. Certainly, observation of your child, particularly for younger kids, an interview of you or an interview of the teacher, or any data collection that's done from that. And there are a handful of tests that have been set up to be used through a telehealth platform, but not as many as are designed for an in-person testing situation. So it is possible that a team may collect as much data as they can and then make a determination that they need to pause until in-person tests are needed, and they will ask for your consent to delay that because they're not able to do, let's say, certain kinds of cognitive testing, for example, or if you have a speech concern, certain kinds of articulation screening and testing without it being in person, given some of the challenges that video conferencing presents. For example, with articulation testing, is that an articulation problem that the child has, or did the internet just cut out briefly in the middle of this video conference? You can sort of see how there might be some challenges there in sort of distinguishing between the two. So another thing to sort of think about is, what happens, if my kid with an IEP gets sick with coronavirus, and they're sent home and they need to self-quarantine for 14 days. This is particularly something that could happen while schools are in hybrid mode, or even attempting to be fully open. A kid with an IEP, a child with an IEP, would need to be classified as needing some homebound instruction because of a medical problem that would have to be ordered by a doctor. And usually these requirements don't kick in until they've been absent for a set number of days, and this is often set at the state or local level. In my experience, it's usually around 10 days, so that 14-day quarantine period might actually meet the threshold for that. And switching to some kind of homebound instruction when school is going on in person would require an IEP team to meet and figure out how that education is going to be provided and what the services would look like. And it could be any combination of Zooming into the classroom, other online classes, or working with a specialized teacher. There's a wide variety of what can happen. So some things to think about if you're the parent of a child with an IEP or a 504 plan. And managing those plans right now is particularly even harder because we're also all working at home, and trying to deal with our own child's learning challenges isn't necessarily something that we're equipped to do. It's something that we were hoping and wanted the school to support for this. So just sort of some basic things to take a look at. Make sure you reviewed your child's IEP or 504 plan recently. Pay attention to any accommodations and supports that were helping. Accommodations that are primarily technological, audiobooks, text-to-speech, that kind of thing, could be offered very easily in a remote setup. Pay attention to whether or not the services are being directly provided by a teacher, or if they're getting some kind of related services support, and whether they're direct or indirect, and asking how is that going to happen. So, once you've got a sense of what the plan says, then you want to communicate with your child's school in terms of seeing, okay, well, who's the point person that might be helping you troubleshooting technology while you're doing remote learning. If there are supports that were supposed to be provided in person that aren't there, You may need to speak to the particular provider directly or to the child's case manager to sort of figure out, well, how is that going to work and what's that schedule going to look like. Um, I think something to bear in mind is that, even though we're going into what's going to be our second period of potential remote learning for many families and many schools, this is still also brand new to teachers. Once upon a time when I was teaching in a teacher preparation program, we were talking about online instruction, but it never once crossed our mind that we would be doing this completely for large groups of students. Certainly, for some smaller groups of students, and there are virtual charter schools, for example, that are out there that have been doing this for a while. Um, but they were the exception, not the norm. So just some general stuff to be aware of. Um, I think some other things to sort of think about is that, the more face-to-face interactions that happen for a child with a disability, frankly, for any child, they're better. Video over audio is also, really more important and works better. You want to make sure that, and I think this again goes for all children, that there are just ongoing uh, checks for understanding happening through whatever modality makes sense, whether that's a survey, a quiz, a chat, but just making sure that children are actually acquiring the concepts that are being discussed. And of course, just as when we were doing instruction in person, we wanted the learning to be multimodal, to come at us in different formats to help with retention. That also needs to happen in online learning. It shouldn't just be delivered from a straight lecture piece. Another thing to be aware of for all children is that they're going to need help with organizing their time. The school day is a very structured creature for most of our kids. And the online learning, as we learned this past spring, provides a lot less structure. So if you're a kid that's struggling with executive functioning, and frankly, most kids are because it's a skill that is developing over time with them, they may need some support in terms of staying organized or staying on task, completing assignments. So, think about where your child is going to be doing their learning. You've got time right now to figure out what are the learning centers going to be in your home for each of your children, and where do they intersect with, if you're continuing to work from home as an adult, your own work environments. Think about calendars and posting them. A great way to sort of visualize what you might need is to think about some of the best classrooms that you've been in, and what the visual prompts are, that they've got calendars up for the day, that they've got schedules listed so that kids know what's happening. Rules are posted in a way to help provide reminders. And I think that this helps sort of, help kids figure out the difference between when it's work time and when it's play time. And I would encourage you to start with more structure rather than less, and you can ease off based upon where your child is developmentally in terms of how they're working on their own routines. Um, so I think those are really the important pieces to note in terms of special education and remote learning. Bear in mind that nothing has changed in terms of the rights that your child has in terms of access to a free and appropriate public education, or FAPE, in the least restrictive environment. And you want to work with your school to make sure that that's taking place. And then I think, just sort of to end on a positive point, one of the things that we want to note is that you've got this amazing opportunity to really get an understanding of how your child works as a learner, in terms of, are they able to follow instructions that are complicated? How does your child react to a lesson that's being presented? And this may be a sort of at least for the moment, a better way of seeing what's going on versus just getting a report card or progress reports back from a teacher. And you may sense some patterns that you might not have noticed otherwise. And then, of course, I think that one of the things that I've been thinking about as we're looking at another period of remote learning Or what are the things that I want my kids to be learning beyond what's going on in the school curriculum? And I think that's something that goes for all of our children, whether they have an identified disability or not, to sort of build up the other skills that could be going on. All right. So thank you for joining me this evening for this conversation about special education and remote learning. Uh, I certainly wish you well as you gear up for the upcoming school year. And I know it's just barely the end of July right now as we record this. Um, but school for many parts of the United States will be starting up soon, and we will be thinking about these things. And I encourage you to be prepared rather than just jumping into this with both feet when the school year starts. So stay tuned here on the Innovative Dad page on Facebook, or check out my website at www.ariaris.com. Or you can find me at Instagram at @ariaris for more parenting tips and strategies and ways to help you navigate the coronavirus crisis from a parenting perspective. Uh, and I'll be back here again with more guidance and support for you. So in the meantime, have a wonderful evening and good night.